You'd think growing up with a golden child sibling would give you thicker skin, right? Not me. If anything, I learned that being the lesser brother in your family doesn't toughen you up. It just makes the betrayals cut deeper when they come from the people you should have been able to trust the most. My name's nobody important, at least, that's how I felt most of my life next to David, my younger brother. He was the golden boy, the apple of my parents' eyes, the kid who could do no wrong even when he literally tried to set my hair on fire once. Mom called it boys being boys. Me? I was the sensible one. The kid who never caused trouble, the one who quietly excelled at school, held down a steady job, and married the love of my life, Karen. And yet, no matter what I did, it was never enough to shine brighter than David's reckless, loud charisma. Karen. God, just typing her name still feels like a gut punch. We met in college. Me, the quiet nerd with a knack for finance, and her, the vibrant, spontaneous woman who seemed like she could bring color to my grayscale world. I loved her. I thought she was my partner, my equal, the one person I could truly lean on when my family made me feel invisible. Spoiler alert, I was wrong. Fast forward a decade, and I thought I had it all figured out. A stable job, a house, a beautiful wife, and a son I adored. Life wasn't perfect, but it was good. Until Karen started acting different. At first, it was subtle. Late nights at work, a new interest in her appearance, more secretive behavior with her phone. I tried to dismiss it, chalking it up to stress or midlife changes. But the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. Then came the conversation. You know the one. She sat me down, looking all contrite, and said, "There's something I need to tell you." My heart sank faster than the Titanic. I braced myself for whatever bombshell she was about to drop, but nothing could have prepared me for her actual words. I've been having an affair with David. David, my brother, my flesh and blood. The guy who spent our childhood tormenting me, stealing my stuff, and mocking me for being a nerd. The guy my parents worshipped like a demigod. The guy who, apparently, was also sleeping with my wife. I wish I could say I reacted with grace or dignity, but I didn't. I yelled. I cried. I slammed my fist on the table so hard the dishes rattled. Karen sat there, looking tearful but oddly composed, like she'd rehearsed this moment in her head 100 times. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said, as if that would somehow make it better. It just did. When I asked her how long this had been going on, she hesitated. That's when I knew it wasn't some one-time mistake. About 2 years, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. 2 years. My brother had been screwing my wife for 2 whole years. But wait, it gets worse. She dropped another bombshell. Our son, my son, might not even be mine. I don't know for sure, she said, as if the ambiguity was supposed to make me feel better. I didn't even finish the conversation. I grabbed my car keys and walked out the door, leaving her sitting there with her crocodile tears and her excuses. I drove aimlessly for hours, replaying her words in my head, trying to make sense of how my life had come to this. When I finally made it home, she was asleep on the couch, her phone clutched in her hand like a lifeline. I resisted the urge to throw it across the room. Instead, I went upstairs, packed a bag, and left. I wish I could say that walking out on Karen made me feel better, but the truth? It just left me hollow. Driving aimlessly had felt like escape, but now that I was sitting in a dingy motel room with a bag of clothes and a mini fridge humming loudly in the corner, all I felt was the crushing weight of everything that had just happened. I hadn't even decided what to do next when my phone buzzed. Mom? Perfect. Exactly what I needed. A call from the one person who would probably find a way to blame this on me. Against my better judgment, I answered. Your wife called, she started, her voice tinged with both concern and irritation. She's very upset. Good, I spat back. Maybe she should have thought about that before sleeping with David. That shut her up, for a second, at least. Then came the real kicker. That doesn't sound like David. Are you sure she isn't just trying to cover for herself? You know how women can be. I almost dropped the phone. Are you kidding me right now, Mom? She admitted it. She told me to my face. And what do you mean? That doesn't sound like David. The guy's been a selfish asshole his whole life. Remember when he stole money out of Dad's wallet to buy weed in high school? That was a phase, she snapped. David's changed. He's a good man now. A good man. Right. A good man who slept with his brother's wife for 2 years and possibly fathered his nephew. I hung up on her before I could say something I'd regret. Or maybe I wouldn't regret it, but still, I wasn't in the mood to deal with her denial. Instead, I decided to confront the source of the problem directly, David. When I showed up at my parents' house, he was there, lounging on the couch like he owned the place. He had that smug, cocky grin on his face that I've hated since we were kids, the one that says, I can get away with anything, and you can't do a damn thing about it. Hey, big bro, he said, barely looking up from his phone. What's up? I didn't waste time with pleasantries. You slept with my wife. That got his attention. He sat up, the grin disappearing. What are you talking about? Don't play dumb, I snapped. Karen told me everything. For a moment, he just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Then he said, Look, man, it wasn't. Don't you dare try to justify it. I cut him off. You betrayed me. You're my brother, and you slept with my wife. At this point, my parents walked in, drawn by the sound of raised voices. What's going on? Dad asked, looking genuinely confused. Of course, Mom already had that defensive look on her face, like she was gearing up to protect her precious baby boy. I explained everything. Karen's confession, the possibility that my son wasn't mine, all of it. By the time I was done, I was practically shaking with rage. My parents, meanwhile, looked like they didn't know what to do with themselves. Dad was the first to speak. David, tell me this isn't true. I didn't mean for it to happen, David mumbled, looking at the floor. I let out a bitter laugh. Wow, you two really rehearsed that line? Huh? She said the exact same thing. That's when Mom jumped in. This is a family matter. We need to handle it privately. Privately? I repeated, incredulous. You mean sweep it under the rug, like you always do when David screws up? Not this time, Mom. Not when my marriage is destroyed, and my son's entire life might be a lie. Her face hardened. He's your brother. Family comes first. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Family comes first? Are you serious? How is sleeping with my wife putting family first? Dad finally spoke up. Look, we can't undo what's happened, but we need to move forward as a family. Fighting won't solve anything. Move forward. I echoed. And what does that look like to you, Dad? Pretending it never happened? Letting David off the hook again? David, meanwhile, just stood there, looking uncomfortable but not particularly remorseful. I'm sorry, man, he said, as if that would magically fix everything. I didn't think it would go this far. Go this far? I repeated, my voice rising. You didn't think sleeping with my wife for 2 years would go this far? What the hell is wrong with you? Mom stepped between us, her hands up like she was breaking up a schoolyard fight. Enough, she said firmly. We'll talk about this later, as a family. No, we won't, I said. Because I'm done. I'm done with all of you. With that, I walked out, slamming the door behind me. As I got into my car, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, sadness, betrayal, and a tiny, liberating sense of relief. For the first time in my life, I wasn't going to let them drag me down with their toxic family dynamics. When I left my parents' house that day, I felt like I was finally seeing them, and David, for what they really were. A family that prioritized appearances, excuses, and sweeping everything under the rug over actual accountability. The realization burned, but it also gave me some much-needed clarity. I was done waiting for them to change. If they couldn't support me in the worst moment of my life, they weren't my family anymore. My first stop was a lawyer's office. If Karen thought she could drop a bombshell like, "Your son might not be yours," and expect me to roll over, she was in for a rude awakening. I told the lawyer everything, about the affair, the timeline, the doubts about paternity. He nodded sympathetically, took a lot of notes, and then explained my options. First up, a paternity test. Do you think she'll cooperate? He asked. I laughed bitterly. She doesn't really have a choice. Getting Karen to agree to the test was easier than I expected. When I called her to arrange it, She didn't fight me. If anything, she sounded resigned. Like she knew this was coming and had already made peace with it. That should have been my first clue that there was more to her story than I realized. While I waited for the test results, I threw myself into work. Anything to distract myself from the endless loop of questions and doubts running through my mind. What would happen if my son wasn't mine? Could I still love him the same way? What kind of person had I married? Really? And why hadn't I seen this coming? Karen, to her credit, wasn't trying to make things harder for me. She stayed out of my way, except for the necessary logistics of setting up visitation with our son. Every time I saw him, my heart broke a little more. He was too young to understand what was happening, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. "Why can't Mommy and Daddy be together anymore?" he asked me once, his little voice trembling. I didn't have an answer for him. Then the test results came back. He was mine. The relief I felt was immediate and overwhelming. I might have lost my marriage, but at least I hadn't lost my son. At least I didn't have to look at him and wonder if he was a constant reminder of Karen and David's betrayal. But even with that weight lifted, I knew there was still a long road ahead. The damage Karen and David had done wasn't something I could just shake off. Around this time, Karen reached out, asking if we could talk. I almost said no, but curiosity got the better of me. I needed answers, even if I wasn't sure I wanted to hear them. We met at a coffee shop, neutral ground. She looked tired, like she hadn't been sleeping much. Good, I thought. She should feel bad. She should feel worse than bad. "I know I don't have any right to ask this," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I need you to understand why it happened." "Why what happened?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. "Why you cheated on me with my brother. Why you lied to me for 2 years. Why you decided to tell me now, after all this time." "All of it," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "I know you hate me, and I don't blame you. But I need you to know it wasn't just about David." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "Then what was it about?" She took a deep breath, like she was steeling herself. "I was lonely," she said. "You were always working, always busy. I felt invisible. And then David, he paid attention to me." I laughed, a short, bitter sound. "So this is my fault? Because I was working to provide for our family?" "No," she said quickly. "I'm not blaming you. I'm just explaining. It wasn't about love or anything like that. It was a mistake. A terrible mistake." I shook my head, struggling to keep my anger in check. A mistake is forgetting someone's birthday. Sleeping with my brother for 2 years is a choice. She didn't argue. Instead, she dropped her gaze to her coffee cup, her hands trembling slightly. "There's one more thing I need to tell you," she said after a long pause. "Something I've been too afraid to admit." Here we go, I thought. Another bombshell. "I ended it with David months ago," she said. "I was trying to fix things between us. That's why I told you. I wanted a clean slate." I stared at her, trying to process her words. Was that supposed to make it better? That she only stopped cheating because she got bored, or guilty, or whatever it was? But then she said something that made my blood run cold. "He didn't take it well. He started threatening me. That's why I couldn't hide it anymore." I was scared. Threatening her? David? That smug, spineless jerk? I didn't believe her, not at first. But the more she talked, the more sense it made. David wasn't used to losing. He wasn't used to hearing no. And if he thought Karen was just going to cut him off and go back to being my wife, I could see how that might bruise his ego. Still, her revelation didn't change anything for me. "So you're saying you told me the truth because you were scared of David, not because you cared about me enough to be honest." She flinched at my words but didn't deny them. And that, more than anything, told me everything I needed to know about where we stood. After my meeting with Karen, I felt like I was carrying a live wire inside me. The revelation that David had been threatening her after their affair ended was both enraging and oddly unsurprising. It fit the pattern. The golden boy couldn't handle not getting his way, so he lashed out. And of course, Karen, for all her flaws, hadn't deserved that. But knowing she'd only confessed to save her own skin didn't exactly fill me with sympathy. I knew I couldn't let this slide. Not anymore. So, for the second time in as many weeks, I found myself driving to my parents' house, preparing for a confrontation I knew wouldn't end well. When I got there, David was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a beer in hand like he didn't have a care in the world. Mom was fussing over something at the stove, and Dad was in his recliner, watching the game. A picture-perfect family moment, except for the fact that it was built on lies. "David," I said, my voice cold and steady, "we need to talk." He looked up, his smirk faltering for just a second before it returned. "Oh, hey man, what's up?" "Don't what's up me," I snapped. "Karen told me everything. About how you threatened her after she ended things with you. About how you tried to manipulate her into keeping your secret." Mom turned from the stove, her face a mix of confusion and annoyance. "What's this now? Threatened? David would never." "Don't defend him, Mom," I said sharply. "Not this time." David, to his credit, didn't deny it. Instead, he rolled his eyes and took another swig of his beer. "She's exaggerating," he said dismissively. "I just told her it wasn't cool to ghost me after everything." "Ghost you?" I repeated, incredulous. "You were screwing my wife, David, for 2 years. And when she finally decided to stop, you couldn't handle it. So you scared her into confessing." "She's the one who came to me," he shot back, his voice rising. "She was miserable with you, always complaining about how you never paid attention to her, how you were too busy with work to notice her. I was just there for her when you weren't." My hands clenched into fists. "Don't you dare try to pin this on me. You're the one who betrayed me. You're the one who couldn't keep your hands off my wife." Dad finally spoke up, his voice stern but weary. "That's enough. Both of you." "No," I said, my voice trembling with barely contained rage. "This isn't enough. It'll never be enough. Because this isn't just about the affair. It's about the fact that you've been letting him get away with crap like this our whole lives." Mom stepped in, her tone defensive. "That's not fair. We've always treated you both equally." I let out a bitter laugh. "Equally? Are you serious? You've made excuses for him every time he screwed up. You've coddled him, bailed him out, and ignored the fact that he's a selfish, manipulative asshole. And now, because of you, he thought he could destroy my life and walk away without consequences." The room fell silent. Even David looked taken aback by my outburst. Mom opened her mouth to say something, but I cut her off. "I'm done," I said, my voice hard. "I'm done pretending this is a family. I'm done letting all of you treat me like I don't matter. From now on, I'm focusing on my son and myself. You can keep defending David all you want, but don't expect me to stick around for it." With that, I turned and walked out, ignoring their protests. I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, relief, sadness, and a faint, flickering sense of hope. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to please them. I wasn't trying to be the good son. I was just done. In the weeks that followed, I started putting my life back together. I set firm boundaries with Karen, agreeing to co-parent our son, but keeping everything else strictly business. I stopped answering my parents' calls, tired of their attempts to mediate between me and David. And as for David, I haven't spoken to him since that day in the kitchen. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I started going to therapy, trying to unpack the years of resentment and hurt I'd been carrying. Slowly but surely, I began to feel lighter, stronger, like I could finally breathe again. It's been a year since everything came crashing down. A year since I found out my wife had been cheating on me with my brother. A year since I walked away from my parents' house, vowing to cut ties with the toxicity that had defined so much of my life. A year since I started learning what it means to truly put myself first. I won't lie, there were days I didn't think I'd make it. Days when the weight of it all felt unbearable, when the anger and sadness were so overwhelming that I couldn't see a way out. But those days became fewer and farther between. Therapy helped. So did focusing on my son. He became my anchor, the one constant in a world that felt like it was spinning out of control. Co-parenting with Karen has been civil. We keep our interactions limited to what's necessary for our son's well-being. She's tried to apologize more than once, but I shut it down every time. There's no point. I'll never forgive her for what she did. Not because I enjoy holding on to the anger, but because forgiveness feels like something she hasn't earned. I don't hate her anymore, though. Mostly, I just feel indifferent. As for David, he's out of my life completely. I blocked his number, his social media, everything. Mom tried to guilt me into talking to him, saying things like, he's your brother, and family is forever. But I stood firm. Family might be forever, but that doesn't mean you have to let them poison your life. The last time I saw my parents, they were hosting a family dinner. I went for my son's sake, figuring it'd be good for him to see his grandparents. But the second I walked in, I knew it was a mistake. David was there, acting like nothing had happened, like he hadn't burned every bridge between us. He even tried to make small talk, asking me how work was going. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "We're not doing this." He had the nerve to act offended. Come on, man. It's been a year. Don't you think it's time to move on? Move on? I couldn't believe his audacity. You don't get to decide when I move on, I told him. And you sure as hell don't get to play the victim here. The rest of the dinner was tense, to say the least. I stayed just long enough to be polite, then left, vowing never to put myself in that position again. And I haven't. If my parents want to keep enabling David, that's their choice. But I'm not sticking around to watch it. Cutting ties with them was hard. Really hard. For all their flaws, they're still my parents, and there's a part of me that will always crave their approval, no matter how much I know I'll never get it. But the peace I've gained from setting those boundaries, it's worth every ounce of pain. Now, I'm focusing on rebuilding. I've thrown myself into my work, not as an escape, but as a way to prove to myself that I can thrive on my own. I've reconnected with old friends, people I lost touch with during my marriage, and it's been a revelation. For the first time in years, I feel like I have a support system, a real one, not the hollow facade my family pretended to offer. And then there's my son. He's the light of my life, the reason I get up in the morning. Watching him grow, seeing the world through his eyes. It's a reminder that there's still so much good out there, even when life feels impossibly hard. He doesn't ask about the divorce as much anymore, though I know he still wishes Karen and I could be together. I just keep telling him the truth, that we both love him more than anything, and that's what matters most. Do I think about what happened? Of course. There are nights when the memories come flooding back, when I replay every conversation, every argument, every betrayal. But those nights don't define me anymore. They're just a part of the story, a story that's still being written. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that healing isn't linear. Some days, I feel like I've got it all figured out. Other days, I feel like I'm back at square one. But the difference now is that I know I'm moving forward, even when it doesn't feel like it. And that's enough. So, here I am. Not perfect, not whole, but getting there. I'm still angry, still hurt. But I'm also hopeful. Because if I've learned anything from this mess, it's that I deserve better. Better than Karen. Better than David. Better than the constant cycle of pain and disappointment my family put me through. I'm not sure what the future holds, but for the first time in a long time, I'm excited to find out.